Okay.
Hi, Phil.
Maurice, how are you? We'll talk. Let's talk sometime today, okay?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Good seeing you.
Hi, Phil. Good to see you again.
Oh, how are you? Good to see familiar faces.
Yeah, yeah. Sometimes, yeah. We met in nonprofit meetings.
Yes.
Yeah.
So thank you for your patience. I contacted the conference organizer, so they will come to record now started. Thank you. So hello, everyone. I appreciate your patience. So we will start our meeting, our session. Our session is part of a nonprofit track, capacity building for social equity. So our panel has 4 presentations today because now we are starting slightly later. So I will just jump into our presentations. So the very strict rule for presentations, each will have a 10 minutes recommended or 12 minutes maximum. Please keep your time. So without further ado, we'll start from our first team. So this session is mainly about how social nonprofit actually incorporate those advocacy and social change and inclusion in their management and policies. That includes multiple areas, including nonprofit capacity building, and also helping those veterans, and also doing the advocacy role. And also we include gender representation in bureaucracy. So I'll invite the first presenters in group, which is my name is Jeong as a moderator and also group member. And we have Dr. Sungju Kim from North Carolina State University. We have Clara Yoon from Kean University. So we have Deborah Spigner, but although cannot join today for our co-authors. So let me share my screen and we'll start presentation. Thank you, everyone. So thank you for your attendance for this session. So our paper and research covered how nonprofit organizations, specifically human service nonprofits, incorporate the social equity components into their practice and policies. We conducted survey with human service nonprofits for 2 groups, scholar group and practitioner group. So our group includes these all I already mentioned, but I think I want to also acknowledge Kean students, part of a capstone project, and also some research assistant, including Iesha Torres. So research motivation includes, we want to understand the social equity, how it is incorporated into nonprofit, their management and policies. And we want to compare also the perception and of scholar group and practitioner group. So we approach the 2 groups differently and through different communication channels. And in terms of looking at the different breakdown of organization, we looked at first governance component, we looked at operation itself, and also we looked at the program strategies. So question include, first of all, as I mentioned, that scholars and practitioners, how they define, perceive differently or similarly about social equity in nonprofit management, specifically human service nonprofits. And we want to look at specifically their incorporation into governance and program operation and management practices. So I'll give the floor to Dr. Kim. Dr. Kim, are you talking or is muted? Hello, am I the only one? I cannot hear you.
I can't hear him either.
Yeah, we can't hear anyone.
Okay, Dr. Kim, we cannot hear you. Are you muted? I cannot see you because I'm sharing my screen. Let me stop sharing. Right, let me stop sharing. Let's see what happens. Oh, he's not in this room now. Okay, so what I will do, I'll give the floor to Clara Yoon, Dr. Yoon first, and then when he comes back, we may give time to him, okay? Thank you for your understanding. This is IT world. A lot of things happens unexpectedly. Okay, so I'll give the floor to Dr. Yoon about the data and method part.
Okay, so I will explain about our data and method. We conducted online survey from April to November last year. We have two surveys. First one is the practitioner group survey, and the other one is for the scholar group survey. For the practitioner group survey, we collected the contact information of the human service nonprofit organization in New Jersey from the GARSAR. And for the scholar group, we use the professional membership reserve listed below and send out our survey. Number of total responses we got is the practitioner group 39, scholar group 29.
So we'll skip this part, but I heard from Dr. Kim, actually there are power outages in his place. Oh. So we may cover on behalf of him. So going back to literature review session, the idea is we want to see how those original PA social equity theory can apply to nonprofit literature. So we want to see social equity in perception in managers and also scholar groups. So we looked at specifically diversity and or representation and cultural competency as a keyword based on those literature, Woodrich and Gunen and 2009 literature that incorporate the idea about those the three components in PA theory. So we want to see how that actually resonated in nonprofit field and also by incorporating nonprofit literature. So that's what we quickly capture on the literature section. Now let's move to the results section to save our time, effectively use more time for the results. So these are part of results from the survey. If you look at how they incorporate social equity into policies, you see mostly they say that yes, but see program operation and also more on towards the management plan part got more higher the rate of the incorporation. And if you go to the effect of COVID-19 between scholar and practitioner group, evenly, also very consistently, scholar groups see the more impact in terms of compare between these two groups, although they see more part in planning and also program operation side. In terms of important diversity criteria, you will see that consistently scholar group gave a higher score, and also gender and race ethnicity got the high score from the scholar group. In terms of most significant stakeholders from the scholar group and practitioner group, it's very interesting. We got the attention that first, the scholar group gave a higher score for the government and foundations, which is actually regulation agency and funders, whereas practitioner group gave a higher score evaluation for clients and also those volunteers and local communities. So in terms of a theory and accountability theory, it's very, very stark a contrast between and the upward and downwards accountability. So see those practitioner groups see more upward accountability versus scholar groups see the more downward accountability. So although we may not confirm the statistical significance, but at least the pattern is very consistent. And in terms of cultural competency, we see very similar pattern between two groups, although in religion, there are some difference. Scholar group gave a higher score for that component. In terms of a keyword for social equity, the scholar group has very high score for equity, diversity, inclusion in terms of those criteria. in social equity, whereas Practitioner gave lots of management and practical components, including cultural competency and belief system. So if we summarize our findings in 2 slides, first of all, the policy incorporation components, see there are slight different levels by policy incorporation, but it's relatively higher management program operation component. And in terms of a pandemic effect, as I show you at the beginning, it shows that higher evaluation score by scholar groups. And also they gave higher score for program operation. In terms of diversity criteria, it emphasized that highly by the scholar group, but relatively very even and across those criteria. In terms of significant stakeholders, as I mentioned earlier, the downward accountability, which means from the top down type of accountability, emphasizing the role of regulatory agencies, which is government agencies, and funders and foundations were emphasized by scholar group, whereas those practitioner group emphasize the clients and local communities and volunteers. And the cultural competency were highlighted, emphasized by both groups, scholar and practitioner group. So as I've already mentioned, that difference between these 2 groups, the scholar group emphasized the more criteria components, and then also included the transparency as part of criteria consideration, whereas the practitioner group emphasized more about management components, including cultural competence in their management and also belief system and mission vision component, which is more directly related to their organizational mission. And also we see this practitioner group highly emphasize the practical management element in there, including cultural competencies. So thank you for your attention, and I'll give the floor to the next group. To save our time, we'll push back all those comments and feedback comments to the end. So without further ado, I'll give the floor to the second group. Thank you. The second group I will invite is Suprana, Soni, and who will present the gender representation in bureaucracy and human rights. Thank you. The floor is yours, Suprana.
Thank you so much, Park. And I loved your research. Thank you. We can talk about it later. Hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to talk to you all. And a little bit of change in my research. I'm still working on it, so not done yet. So all right, let me share my. Okay. All right. So this is democracy, human rights, and nonprofit. Of course, bureaucracy also is one aspect that I'm looking at. But in this specific panel, I thought this is the right paper that I'm working on is more suitable. So in this kind of research that with multiple questions maybe could be, but the one thing that I, kind of questioning in this one, especially trying to understand the relationship of democracy and human rights. And especially in political science literature, many studies have looked at democracy and human rights relationship. And they certainly suggested that democracy protects human rights. So basically democracy and human rights goes hand in hand. And the tons of literature, they looked at several aspects of how democracy or what type of democracy is more protective for human rights. So, whether it's their economic status, they looked at other variables as well. Economic status, maybe their, women representation, especially, and other aspects also they looked at. And especially women human right in women human right protection, women human right in representation in parliament, and in some research slightly looked at in local government, how they have an impact in human right and democracy and human right relationship. So in in this relationship, when they look at women's human right, not just democracy human right relationship, but specifically women human right, they perceived human right as a subset, or that's how human right has been conceptualized. And any human right data, for example, Siri and all those, they basically look at women's human right as a subset of general human right. And especially those human right conceive human right as in the context of state repression. State is seen as the perpetrator of violating any human right of the citizen. So basically, in most of these literature or human right concept, state is conceived as or perceived as the main perpetrator of human right violations. On that note, when we look at especially women's human right, there's not only women human right, but in general, many human rights are beyond state repression. State may not be directly involved in those kind of violations. So not all human rights are about state repression. And many times that we've seen is women human rights, especially in general, other human rights will be against gender, any marginalized community, sometimes based on gender, race, sexual orientation, on any kind of aspects. We've seen that many times the human right violations are not directly done by state. Many times we've seen that it is done by non-state actors. So specifically women human right violations, many times are done by non-state actors, and many times it occurs in a private sphere. So for example, girl is not going to school, or domestic violence. In those cases, state actors are not directly involved. Maybe if some family decides not to send their kids to school, it's the family choice and not state. State could do, send a school and, build state schools and send teachers and everything, but sending kid to a school is a private affair. So in those examples, we see that state repression argument or conceptualization may not be necessarily true in understanding the relationship of state democracy, human rights. So I look at one kind of CEDAW understanding, and CEDAW I think is more suitable and more relevant when we specifically look at women human rights. And under the and CEDAW has three principles, and especially state obligation principle. CEDAW looks at what obligations state do have in terms of protecting human rights, not just kind of seen as a perpetrator, but what are the things that state can do in terms of protecting human rights. So these are the things that respect, protect, promote, and fulfill. These are the measures that a state should take. If a state ratifies CEDAW, they are supposed to take those measures, and those measures are being monitored. So not only just having those policies and law on paper, but also how they're being implemented, how they're being enforced. That's the core thing of CEDAW. And so on that note, I just also kind of thought that, that's why when we just look at democracy and human rights and not look at some of the other aspects, how those policies are implemented, we would not be able to touch upon the real issues, and especially the human rights violations done by non-state actors. So if you look at one kind of data that I looked at is in this kind of cross-tabulation I did, and in this one, in this cross-tabulation, we see, when we say democracy, the highly ranked democracy that has 6 in the scale, and we would assume, and this here is women right. This is basically, this data looks at the discrepancy. This is what I had here, is about discrepancy and discrepancy between national law and practice concerning women and concerning women. And these, according to this data set, if there's 0, meaning there's no discrepancy, meaning the state is doing a great job. But 1 is some discrepancy, what they promise and do not implement those policies. So those kind of thing, this is how they coded this kind of data. So if a state is 6, we all know that there should be electoral democracy is very established. But in women's discrepancy, if 0 is good, then we would think they are doing a great job. But we would see in this data that was surprising is that only two countries are here that have high scale in democracy and 0 discrepancy. And all the other numbers, percentage of countries that are C, in 6 that have 6th rank in democracy, but most of them have lower down in terms of discrepancy, meaning they have some kind of discrepancy, or some of these are some actually have no, very implementation or enforcement of those policies are very, very concerning. So while looking at by looking at these data, these numbers just basically gives us an idea that just having democracy doesn't mean much, and just looking at human right data is not enough. If we need to look at the enforcement, these are the data are very, very useful, specifically women in protecting and promoting women's rights. So going back to this kind of relationship, I think the nonprofit advocacy is very, very crucial, and literature does, but many literature that I look at in nonprofit advocacy, there's several aspects of advocacy has been studied, tons of studies. But one thing I feel that there's very little we know about the role of nonprofit advocacy in policy implementation and human rights protection. Some studies are there, but not directly, in some kind of indirect way, but not many. So that is what I'm thinking. We need to know more about how nonprofit. I mean, I strongly believe that nonprofit organizations and nonprofit advocacy plays a crucial role in those kind of human rights protection. So going back to those examples that I mentioned in the beginning, for example, school attendance and domestic violence. If a woman is not going or a family is not sending their girl child to a school, especially in some developing countries, nonprofit advocacy becomes very, very important role. Maybe they do, and not literature also suggests, and some anecdotal examples also suggest that many times when family is not willing to send their girl child to a school, these nonprofit advocacy can enforce state to come up with some policy, to some kind of enabling, some kind of approach in terms of that can enable and motivate the family to send that, or some kind of arrangement, maybe if they need some kind of arrangement to send their girls to school, or some kind of safety. So those things in those areas, even democracy and generating human rights, all awareness, all those kind of things, state has a crucial role state nonprofit organization has a crucial role in promoting human rights and protecting human rights. Even though these small things, it looks very small things, getting equal education, or maybe may not, how upper caste or race, how they're treating people in respecting those kind of race disparity or caste disparity and all those things. On all those places, nonprofit organization have a huge main role in promoting and protecting human rights. So those are the things that we do that this is where nonprofit has, and we need to know more about it.
Suprana, you have 1 minute left.
Yeah, okay, I'll make it quick. So there's a clear association, human rights and democracy is important, but along those lines, my main kind of research question is that if and how, if nonprofit advocacy is important in implementation of promoting and protecting human rights, and also effectively co-producing democratic outcomes, especially in terms of women human rights. And this is the main research question that I'm looking at. And I know that this question is broad, and it can be looked at from different perspectives. So I have currently, I'm looking at some statistical, analysis is not here yet, but I'm still working on data and to look at some of the, statistical kind of analysis and see how nonprofit advocacy plays a role in democracy and human rights relationship. But it's, again, certainly in future research, some case studies, specific countries aspects can be also looked at. That's it. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Suprana, for the wonderful, very insightful presentation with seeing the both sides of action and also advocacy role of nonprofits, and in both ways, protecting or even violating. Thank you very much, Suprana. I look forward to hearing more in the discussion session. So I'll invite the next speaker. Next speaker will be the Philip Nufrio, and he will present about empowering and providing social equity to veterans. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Bach.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. I just need to open up my presentation here. I had to do screenshots on my presentation because there was a problem importing them into PowerPoint. So if you could just bear with my screenshots, I would appreciate it. So my presentation is on the nonprofit consulting I've been doing, working with Jeff's Camp, which is a registered 501(c)(3) in Barnegat, New Jersey. And I'll get to Jeff's Camp mission in a minute. I'm almost afraid to say this. I'm now entering my 6th decade of consulting in the nonprofit government arena. I'm now a professor emeritus at Metropolitan College of New York. And last fall, I was the Democratic candidate for Ocean County Commissioner in Ocean County, New Jersey, which is a county that comprises over 30 municipalities. And during the course of my campaign work, I forged a relationship with veterans organizations, and among them was Jeff's Camp. Just to give you a little background, we have probably the largest population of veterans in Ocean County in the state of New Jersey, with over 30,000 veterans. And there's a huge underserved veterans community that are struggling with addictions, mental health issues, and homelessness. Jeff's Camp was created in the past year and just recently afforded its nonprofit status by a gentleman by the name of Marty Weber, a veteran, an American veteran. He donated 36 acres of land in the Pinelands, which is a preservation area of Ocean County, New Jersey, which is designated as a campus. It's going to be a $3 million plus campus setting that will provide services to homeless veterans or veterans with mental issues and addictions to help them on the road to recovery and self-sufficiency. They asked me to join the executive team as the director of strategic planning, an unpaid position. And since January, I've been working with them in developing a strategic planning process, more or less patterned after John Bryson's model on strategic planning for nonprofit organizations. Just to give you a little, and I would encourage any of you to go to jeffscamp.com if you care to make a contribution, because we're out to really try to accomplish great things at Jeff's Camp. And yeah, as many of you know, if you've worked with nonprofits, the biggest challenge for nonprofits is fundraising and being able to fund their activities. Many nonprofits do get support from the federal government, state and local governments. We're at the very early stages of trying to do that with Jeff's Camp. And again, it was named for Marty's late partner in life, Jeff Poussant. And we're talking about 36 acres of land that will be used to dedicate this great multi-service facility to serve the underserved veterans of New Jersey and Ocean County. Again, we're a nonprofit corporation organized to exclusively help veterans and their families overcome mental illness, addiction, homelessness, and poverty. The site is being designed to a one-day house drug and mental health facility, temporary and permanent housing, and offices providing education, training, and job placement. So it's a wonderful project with a great goal in mind, and I'm very excited to be part of the executive team. And my role, again, since January, has been to guide them through a strategic planning process. My role, again, they welcome me in the board of directors, is to be the director of strategic planning. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what we've been doing the last few months. and the challenges that we're faced with in, jump starting the organization and doing a strategic planning effort. So again, it's patterned after Bryson's strategic planning process model. And, we're following all of the steps that Bryson advocates in strategic planning. We spent some upfront work, what we call planning the plan, trying to get commitment at the executive board level. And we did this in a very, very short time window where, literally I gave assignments on the different elements of strategic planning, starting with the mission, mandates, and values of the organization. And we led that into a SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and challenges. And we went as far, and that's where we are right now. We've developed detailed goals and tasks, milestones, cost factors associated with 7 major areas where we need to see both short and long-term outcomes with regard to getting us to accomplish our mission and reaching the goals of Jeff's camp. This was this report here pretty summarizes what we've done to date. So one of the things I did was I worked closely with the CEO, Marty Weber, to because when we talk about strategic planning, it has to be a process that's managed by management. It can't become where the consultant, in this case, I'm the consultant and the director of strategic planning, my process. It's got to be bought in by the CEO, and the CEO has to see it through right from beginning to end and use the strategic planning process to manage both the day-to-day operations and the short and long-term goals of the organization. So you can see here what I mapped out with Marty was, what is a strategic plan? What's the purpose of a strategic plan? And was to provide a roadmap to achieving the mission and objectives of Jeff's camp. We entertained having each member of the board of director and Jeff's camp's officers to play an active role in designing and implementing the details of the strategic plan. Part of that in the first meeting is to map out the key role players, get everybody to understand what their role is in the strategic planning process, beginning with the CEO, Marty Weber, describing what Phil Nufrio is doing as the strategic planning advisor, director, and facilitator, and then mapping out what the role of the board of directors should be in the strategic planning process, which includes identifying key issues, goals, outcomes that are produced in the strategic planning process. We have a secretary to record whenever we have a meeting mapping out our mission, goals, SWOT, specific tasks and sub-milestones to kind of keep the process alive, so that after each meeting we have a recorded report on what we did, in that specific segment or activity of the strategic planning process. So what I did initially was, as anybody would do when introducing a strategic plan, is to, and it was the role of professor here, being able to describe some of the key terms in strategic planning that would guide the process, starting with the mission statement, explaining what a SWOT analysis is regarding environmental assessment of those factors that impinge upon meeting the mission, impeding the mission, having them fold into strategic issues, which then become the basis for goals, and then tasks under each goal, which would be assigned to key officers within Jeff's camp, define the outcomes to each goal, implement an action agenda for that goal, and then eventually leading to evaluating results. I'm trying right now, I'm at the point where we've reached sort of a little roadblock where they're so excited about getting work done. They're getting work done now without really keeping up to date with the initial goal and tasks involved. So I'm trying to sort of get them to slow down a little bit and generate reports, even if they're every 2 months, so that we'll have something to evaluate results and reevaluate outcomes at the end of the year. So,
Phil, sorry to cut. You have 2 minutes left.
okay, very good. So I guided them basically in 8 key result areas that led to developing specific objectives. We came up with core values that underpin our mission. We did a stakeholder analysis, and ultimately we've defined our stakeholders. So we're at the point right now where we're implementing. Our biggest challenge right now is to get approval by the Pinelands Commission, because the area that this campus is located is in a state preserve that requires approvals from the Pineland Commission so that we can actually begin to break ground. So that's part of our initial priority. And concurrent with that is fundraising. You can't accomplish anything without fundraising. And with a $3 million goal, we have to make sure that we keep a very strong focus on fundraising so that we can accomplish the mission of creating this wonderful campus for veterans and their families. And again, like I said, we've reached sort of an initial stalemate because people are moving so far ahead that they can't step back and say, well, how do we build this into our document, our strategic plan, so that we'll have something to reflect on both, on a regular basis as well as at the end of the year. So with that, I'll be welcome to hear any questions on this great project and how we're actually trying to make things happen at a very practical level. This is taking the theory and putting it into practice. And I'm very proud to be associated with this group, and we're hoping that we'll accomplish our short and long-term mission.
Thank you very much, Phil. Thank you for showing how scholars can engage in real practice using their skills and expertise after their scholarly work. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bob.
Thank you. So we have a final presenter. Jodi Benenson will present the focusing on centering equity and inclusion in nonprofit advocacy and policy change. Jodi, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. And thank you, Phil, for that presentation. I taught strategic planning last semester, so definitely brought back a lot of memories of John Bryson's framework. So thank you. Can everybody see this okay? Good. All right. Fantastic. Well, thank you again to everybody for the opportunity to be here today. I'll try to keep this as quick as possible because I know we want to save some time for discussion. But again, my name is Jodi Benenson, and I am an assistant professor in the School of Public Administration here in Omaha, Nebraska. And my colleague, Yeonkyung Kim, who's a doctoral candidate in the school, my co-author for this project and this particular paper, she's actually getting married this week in the next couple of days. So let's send some good thoughts her way. And we're really looking forward to sharing some research in a project that provides us with the opportunity to center inclusion alongside influence and effectiveness when looking at the ways specifically nonprofit organizations engage with advocacy efforts to create some policy change. And so just a little bit of background. We all know that nonprofit organizations are important civil actors and especially play important roles in the policymaking process. And many of us have played roles in advocacy efforts with nonprofit organizations or alongside nonprofit organizations. In this photo, actually, you can see here is a group of advocates here in Nebraska from the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, doing some work just last year. We also know, though, that when thinking about the role actors play, specifically nonprofit stakeholders, can vary and can involve a lot of different types of stakeholders, thinking about groups like board members, clients of organizations, members, staff, and volunteers. But there aren't a lot of frameworks out there, at least in the nonprofit literature, social equity literature, and public policy literature, that actually allow us to think about what inclusion and equity look like alongside whether or not an organization is actually contributing to influence and effectiveness when engaging in policy advocacy. And we think this is important for a couple of reasons. First of all, we know that nonprofit leaders involved in advocacy efforts may consider a variety of different factors when selecting which stakeholders that they might want to engage in specific advocacy efforts. So from kind of this tactical perspective out here, we kind of typically see in kind of the research and just in practice and I used to be involved in more direct advocacy work prior to pursuing an academic career. And, we found a lot of times, and we see this in the literature as well, that nonprofit leaders might consider the expertise of a stakeholder that might have a particular subject matter, be a subject matter expert, like an executive director or a board member. And oftentimes when considering expertise within an organization, leaders will pick people that might be hold positions at higher levels in organizations, or more powerful positions tend to be seen as the most effective advocates for policy change. But we know both through experience and through literature that there are people who are a part of nonprofit organizations, like volunteers, members, frontline providers. Those affected by policy might actually hold lived experiences and expertise on a specific policy topic, and might be more effective or equally as effective as a board member, donor, or a member of a higher ranking position in an organization. But little research actually has explored this, specifically who and which nonprofit stakeholders are actually effective for implementing policy change. So to kind of guide this work, we've actually drawn from a lot of the research in kind of the social equity spaces, in nonprofit research and policy frameworks, to really kind of start thinking about what kind of framework would allow us to ask some new question that would consider advocacy influence alongside effectiveness. And so this framework really kind of helps us answer this broader question of how does centering inclusion and influence allow us to better understand equity and effectiveness when it comes to nonprofit advocacy and policy change. And so as you can see here in this slide, we have a little 2x2 framework, which we propose that all of these things need to be considered. So we have high levels of inclusion and low levels of inclusion in a nonprofit organization, and perceptions around what types of, which stakeholders are more influential, kind of these higher levels, and which ones are less influential. And I'm going to go through very briefly, just for purposes of time, these 4 different quadrants here. So first we have here in this kind of upper left-hand corner, people that are highly influential and inclusive and influential in their nonprofit advocacy efforts. And this is kind of the dream scenario in which nonprofit organizations are highly inclusive and influential when it comes to their advocacy efforts. So in this case, nonprofit leaders view all stakeholders, whether that's a volunteer or a board member, as having knowledge and expertise in a particular policy issue or area. In this scenario, policymakers also view these stakeholders as influential advocates for creating policy change. Now, moving over to this little rectangle here, we have organizations and leaders that have low levels of inclusion, but are highly influential in their nonprofit advocacy efforts. So this is, again, the other end of the inclusion spectrum, where nonprofit organizations and leaders are less likely to value different forms of knowledge and expertise, or might even just not be connected to people from particular population groups and people with this knowledge and expertise, but there are specific stakeholders that they perceive to be effective. And in this scenario, policymakers also view these stakeholders as influential advocates for creating policy change. But something that we're interested in looking at a little further is the fact that low levels of inclusion could actually have impacts on organizational culture or other factors that we might want to explore to really kind of compare these to more inclusive environments. In this upper right-hand quadrant, we have organizations and leaders that have high levels of inclusion, but are not influential. So here, nonprofit and leaders might be really, really inclusive, but it's possible that the policymaker does not value the stakeholder in the same way as the nonprofit does, or there could be something actually happening in the political environment that influences these perceptions of particular actors within these different groups. And then finally, we have organizations and leaders that are neither inclusive or influential in the bottom right-hand corner here. And in this case, nonprofit organizations and leaders are less likely to value different forms of knowledge and expertise, and policymakers also may not view these stakeholders as influential advocates. And so the reason we kind of want to show you this framework is because we think it actually invites us to explore some new questions that center inclusion alongside influence and advocacy. And some of these questions might be asking about what types of knowledges and expertise are valued for nonprofit advocacy efforts in different types of organizations, what organizational factors influence whether nonprofit leaders are effective, what resources might be needed toward or to aim toward more inclusive and influential policy advocacy efforts, and who do nonprofit policymakers or nonprofit organizations and policymakers actually consider to be influential actors in policymaking processes. You know, we believe also that this framework invites and requires the collection and triangulation of multiple forms of data from both nonprofit sector data, data from policymakers, and not just one group. And so just moving forward, I have a little bit of time, just tracking myself here. For the next couple of minutes, I want to actually we want to kind of show what it might look like to answer this last question here, which is specifically, who do nonprofit organizations and policymakers consider to be influential actors in the policymaking process? So to do this question, or to answer this question, we actually
you have 2 minutes left.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you.
No, that's perfect. We used some data from the 2018 Nebraska Nonprofit Advocacy Survey, and one of my awesome research assistants on this project, Felipe Blanco, is actually here today as well. So thanks for being here, Felipe, where we actually asked nonprofit leaders and policymakers questions. And we're specifically going to focus on the question that asked both of these groups of their perceptions on which nonprofit stakeholders could most effectively influence policy change. We had a lot of other different questions as well, which I'd be happy to talk more about, but I'm going to actually share some of our just very high level descriptive analyses in the next minute or so, just to wrap up. So as you can see here on the left-hand side are the list of nonprofit stakeholders that we asked about. And we essentially asked from a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being their perceptions around whether or not they felt that this group was influential, and 1 being not influential at all, 5 being extremely influential. And just in terms of our findings, I just want to share some top level findings of kind of what this framework allows us to do. For instance, if you kind of look at this top level here, you can see that both nonprofit leaders and policymakers do perceive individual members and clients to be highly influential when it comes to advocacy. But if we look more closer, there are actually more nonprofit leaders who perceive this group in the lower influence group than compared to, policymakers. So overall, it seems like they're pretty much on the same page, but not exactly. But it actually gets interesting when we look at specifically direct service providers and individual policy efforts. Here, when looking at direct service providers, which might be healthcare providers or social workers, they're seen as highly influential from the perspective of policymakers, but not at all influential from direct service providers. And same from individual policy experts. It's probably not surprising that policymakers value individual policy experts. And just finally, the final finding I want to point out is this group of elected and appointed officials. 82% of our policymaker sample is made up of elected officials. So it's probably, again, not surprising to see a high level of belief that elected and public officials can be influential in kind of creating policy change, right? Not surprising. But it is an important reminder that nonprofits, especially given how low this number is here, should be mindful of the power of this stakeholder group and consider this role in their advocacy strategies. So just to wrap up, we feel like kind of this framework invites us to do things like this, to really kind of examine issues of equity and effectiveness when it comes to policy change, and to explore inclusiveness and look at different forms of data to be answering some questions. And moving forward, we're going to be doing some additional work using this framework to guide other research and hopefully continue to partner with nonprofits and policymakers along the way. So that's it. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Jodi. This is wonderful research that has high impact in how we see the advocacy roles of nonprofits, and also stakeholder approach is fascinating. Thank you very much, Jodi. So we got 4 presentations we shared. So we only have 5 minutes left. I know 5 minutes is not enough to even discuss one question, but If anyone has questions, please raise your hand or maybe type in your chat box. We'll share with the panelists. Anyone has any questions? If not, I may quickly, oh, I see it's a hand, hold a moment. I saw hand, someone raised, no? Oh, okay, I see the Maurice. So floor yours, Maurice.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you for the panelists for such wonderful presentations. Phil, I'll be talking to you about veterans in New Jersey. I have a lot of interest in that. I think that in terms of my own research, I think that there is a value in sort of the impact that culture and institutional systemic racism impacts how specific ethnic nonprofit organizations value and perceive, external key opinion leaders. Sometimes there's a lack of trust coming from both ends, and so there is sort of a closing of the ranks. Is what my research suggests, in the sense of how they value the external key leaders don't think that these organizations are successful or not going to be successful in the long term, so they don't really invest a lot, and these organizations feel that. And so the idea of the presentation before about how nonprofit leaders value stakeholders and how academics value sort of federal stakeholders, there's an incongruency in that, really. But I certainly understand from my literature and my research why those two groups see value differently. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Maurice. But such a great comment. See, some kind of the findings from different presentations today sometimes incongruent, but actually there's a reason. So Maurice, your point made really helpful for us. Thank you. And anyone else to give your comment or feedback or any questions?
I have a question.
Yes, please.
My question is also about the Jeff camp. Dr. Phil, he mentioned that there is a set goal, I think, as far as funding at a $3.1 million goal. My question is, Dr. Phil, do you anticipate on also getting funds from the government? I know lots of times nonprofits, they don't all the time receive government funds. So I was just wondering if by chance you anticipate on, if the $3.1 million is not enough, will you get funds from the government?
Well, one of the things we're doing is we're trying to bring in our local congressional representatives from the federal government and have them see, bring them down to the site, show them what we're doing, and get them to be advocates for us with the VA and other federal agencies that could, provide us some funding so that we can, reach our goal of creating this great campus. So your answer to your question is yes. And we're lobbying with our local congressional representatives. It's part of our strict strategy, in fundraising.
Thank you, sir.
All right, thank you for the question and answer, Phil. So any questions or comments from the audience? So I know we want to have more time after fascinating presentations. The last wrapping up remarks, today's 4 presentations in a different angles, they show that how advocacy plays its role and also how it's perceived differently by stakeholders, and either by scholarly or practitioner, or by policymakers or nonprofit managers, and also by gender perspective, and also in terms of real practice shared by nonprofits. So I'm also working with Dr. Kean on a different project on nonprofit advocacy and the functions. So we see the advocacy is sometimes very elusive in terms of how we see the real impact and how it's operated by nonprofits. So maybe this is a great panel. We start our conversation, and based on 4 presentations, we may actually share going forward, maybe find some common ground. So in that sense, today's presentation was very informative and also very helpful and insightful. So, I would like to thank everyone for your time. And if anyone from our panel have anything to want to say, just this is time, given that they're not really shutting down the meeting yet. So any comments?
I think there are some questions in the chat.
Okay. Oh, question to Jodi. DI is used in a variety of ways. Sometimes diversity is often used interchangeably with inclusion. Did you conceptually define the inclusion in your study? Did you conceptually identify the inclusion as a different concept as diversity or equity?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Kim. I think that's a great question. And the answer is yes, we see them as separate. They are separate terms, so we don't see inclusion as a proxy for equity. And we've drawn a lot from the research and just practice work on inclusion specifically, thinking about what it actually, I think we're going to be closed soon, so I'll keep this brief and maybe we could chat more about this sometime. But really thinking about what it means to be an inclusive organization from thinking about representation in particular, and what that actually, and then what the spillover effects might be from being inclusive. Potentially it could be good, but it actually could be really bad, especially thinking, Maurice, about kind of what you shared in terms of just structural racism, institutional racism, and power imbalances, and recognition of perspectives and cultures, et cetera. So I think there's a lot of work we need to do, but to be continued. But to shortly answer your question, we are using inclusion just as inclusion, but we do think it has significant equity implications.
Great, thank you, Jodi, for your clarifying answer. Maybe we can continue our conversation after this session today.
Sounds good.
Yeah, thank you, everyone, all panelists, because the setting as is the play now is the webinar is shutting down now. So thank you, everyone, for your time, and look forward to continuing interacting with you in the conference. Thank you. Bye.